So the first thing I wanted to do was welcome you here. I know people welcomed you at the first sessions, but isn't it wonderful to be back? It feels like we were almost here just a few weeks ago. It's so nice to be back here and in the library. So David, I just wanted to introduce you a little. You were the librarian at Duke, or one of the librarians there for many, many years. You then went to New York, and you were the director of the library. And the last section of your career was at the U.S. Archives. And what I wanted to start out with is, I actually had no idea who you were, and I really had no idea what the National Archives do, and so I'm embarrassed in some sense to say that, but it is so interesting and so fascinating and involves so many more aspects of our government and what our government is about and what our democracy is about. So I'm glad that you're going to get to explain that. But the first thing I wanted to ask you, you spent most of your career as a librarian. Here you are in a library at a book festival. What does that feel like?
And I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf that I want to turn around and take a look at. I want to know how these books were chosen and how many of them I've read. And I sat in 2 sessions already in this room focused on these books behind me. This is such a gift to the staff of this library to have this activity going on to celebrate the book. And that's basically what this whole festival is about. And as a librarian, I thank anyone who's supporting this kind of activity, and I'm jealous.
So what is an archivist, and how does that differ from being a librarian?
Well, there's a great deal of controversy within the professions and the very separate professions about the distinction of librarians versus archivists, and it's which I've tried to, for 12 or 13 years, tried to break down. Basically, the mission of each of those professions is the same. It's collecting, protecting, and encouraging the use of, and fill in the blank. And the blank is what distinguishes librarians from archivists. Archivists are responsible for primary materials, the records of an institution, a corporation, family records, so original records, as opposed to libraries, which deal with published materials. That's not to denigrate the fact that libraries also have special collections and archives, which does kind of the manuscript activities that archives do. But for the National Archives, it is collecting, protecting, and encouraging the use of the records of the U.S. government, anything created by the government.
So the first thing that was a surprise to me is that the U.S. Archivist is a presidential appointment.
It is.
So tell us about that process of your appointment.
As you said, I was at the New York Public Library in what looks like, from this perspective, a very cushy job as director of libraries. I had a wonderful office on Fifth Avenue. I had a couple of lions outside my window. And on a Friday afternoon in 2009, April 2009, my assistant came into the office and said, "The White House is on the phone." So I got on the phone, and this 12-year-old who was working on appointments for the president said, "We're looking at you for Archivist of the United States." And it was completely out of the blue, not something that was ever on my radar screen. I was stunned, and had in my head, what my impression of what a presidential appointment was. Usually someone who knew the president, someone who had contributed a lot of money to a campaign, but never, and usually someone who didn't know the business of the appointment, of the agency or.
So this 12-year-old calls, and how did that conversation go?
I'm very impressed. I'm very flattered that you're looking at me, but you're looking at the wrong guy. And this was on a Friday afternoon, and he said, "Would you think about it over the weekend, and we can talk again next week?" So Monday morning, he called back. We had the same conversation. This kid, Kyle Watkins, his name is. He was an undergraduate at George Washington University, working for David Jacobson, who was head of appointments for the president. And I said, I'm really flattered, but you need to look elsewhere. 10 minutes later, an adult called and asked if he could come to New York and talk to me about the job. This was Tom Wheeler, who later became the head of the FCC, was a close associate of the president, and served on the National Archives Foundation board. So he came to, and he's a Lincoln scholar. He came to Washington and came to New York and talked about what the administration was looking for in the...
This is Obama, during the Obama administration.
2009, right? The Obama Open Government Initiative of openness, transparency, and collaboration, and the feeling that the National Archives had an important role to play in this new initiative, and that Kyle himself, he's the one who found me, Googling people, a little snapshot of how appointments are made, and he's the one who presented me to his boss.
And how were you convinced to do this?
It was the fact that, first of all, getting over the suspicion of why are you hiring someone who knows the business? Because I do know the business. 31 years at MIT, in the libraries at MIT.
To not being a political appointment.
Exactly. And I knew the business. In every one of my responsibilities, MIT, Duke, and the New York Public Library, I was responsible for the archives of those institutions, as well as the library functions. So I had all of that behind me. But it was the idea, the opportunity to think about how the archives, using the records of the government, could contribute to this open government aspect. How could we open up the records of the archives in a way that haven't been done before to contribute to that? And frankly, it was the opportunity to work in the Obama administration. I hadn't been as excited about our government since JFK. And it was that which tipped the scale for me.
In your confirmation hearing, was it like we see for judges, or was it?
It was, compared to what goes on today in confirmation hearings, it was a walk in the park. After I came to Washington and I was invited to come to Washington and meet with the search committee and Kyle's boss, and then began the lockdown of any kind of any talk that I could, any communication I could have about what was going on, because the FBI had then launched their vetting process, and there were teams of folks all over the country talking to anyone who I had ever talked to in my life. And I kept getting queries from old friends like, what's going on? And all the FBI could say to these people was, it's not a criminal investigation. So finally, when it was announced, talk about conversation within the profession, on one of the historian listservs, I'm still looking for Harriet, this historian who criticized the appointment as he's only a librarian. That was how she characterized my appointment. The vetting
should have had the FBI look.
Yeah. The vetting process includes, once you've passed that and the announcement is made about who the candidate is, then a process of meeting every member of the Senate Confirmation Committee. And so I, accompanied by a shepherd from the White House, visited every one of the members of the committee, several meetings with Tom Carper from Delaware, who was chair of this confirmation hearing. And my favorite meeting was with an unnamed senator who asked me the killer question, so why is it that you want to be the architect of the United States?
He knew about as much as I did, it sounds like, about what you do. So the next thing that's... go ahead.
So I let it pass. We talked about his records and archives and personal papers, and I got his stuff out of the attic, which was an accomplishment. And as we were leaving, the shepherd turned to me and said, "Did he say architect?" So that gave me that was my first meeting with senators, and it gave me my first impressions of what Congress is like.
So the next thing I learned was about the creation of the National Archives. And it didn't always exist. So
It didn't.
Tell us about the creation.
It did not. It wasn't until, it's embarrassing when I have met with my international counterparts in Europe about how young the Archives of the United States is. It was created in legislation was signed in 1934 by FDR, creating the National Archives. So we're a baby agency, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't concern about the records of the country from the very beginning. There's a great story about the last session of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, and the question from the representative from New York, what will we do with the journals? And the suggestion from New York to burn them. In great horror, they said they would leave that decision to Washington, and Washington decided to keep them, and thank God that he did, because we do have them. But then I discovered a couple of wonderful letters from Thomas Jefferson about the records of the country and what we should be doing. So in a letter in 1789, he says, "Wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government, that whenever things go far wrong so as to attract their notice, they may be relied on to set them to rights." And 2 years later, he wrote, "Time and accident are committing daily havoc on the originals deposited in our public offices. The late war has done the work of centuries in this business. The lost cannot be recovered, but let us save what remains, not by vaults and locks which fence them from the public eye and use, in considering them to be the waste of time, but by such multiplication of copies as shall place them beyond the reach of accident." Multiplication of copies. And I use that as my defense for digitization of our records. Thomas Jefferson is the grandfather of digitization as far as I'm concerned, because all my focus for 12 years was digitizing as much as we can to get them out so that people can see them. So from the very beginning, access to the records was very important, and the best encapsulation of that attitude was the words of FDR in dedicating his presidential library in Hyde Park in 1941. He likened the dedication of the library as an act of faith, to bring together the records of the past and to house them in buildings where they will be preserved for the use of men and women in the future. A nation must believe in three things. It must believe in the past, it must believe in the future, it must, above all, believe in the capacity of its own people so to learn from the past that they can gain in judgment in creating their own future. So making sure that the records were available to the American people so that they can hold their government accountable for its actions and learn from our past.
And that was the first presidential library, right? FDR?
FDR's was the first, yes.
And to jump...
Chronologically, in terms of actual creation, yes, but Herbert Hoover, as soon as he heard about the FDR library, he decided he wanted one. So in the family of National Archives presidential libraries, Herbert Hoover's in West Branch, Iowa, is the first of the 15 presidential libraries.
So this question probably relates to what you just read, but why should we care if there's an archives? And is it important, in your opinion, to our democracy?
Yeah, I think it's kind of important. I worked in an office in a building in Washington next to the Constitution of the United States, next to the Declaration of Independence. The United States, unlike most other countries in the world, celebrate our founding documents. They are housed in a museum-type environment where millions of people come through and learn from our roots in terms of the responsibilities and rights that are given to us through those documents. in every one of the records in the National Archives. We're talking about the two sets of laws that govern the work of the National Archives, the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act. And the Federal Records Act covers all of the records created by the executive branch, the 275 departments and cabinet level agencies. And the Presidential Records Act, everything coming out of the created in the White House. How decisions are made, who's involved, the documentation that supports those conversations, all of that is part of our history and is used today, still used today, in history repeating itself with interesting conversations going on in Congress about problems that have been discussed for 20 years. And the referral back to when it was last discussed and the movement of material back and forth from the Hill to the agencies to review how this situation may have been handled in the past. So there's a reliance from government itself on our past records, but by individual citizens. One of the saddest collections within the executive branch archives are the 375 treaties with Indian nations that were signed by the United States. Treaties that spelled out what the government promised the native tribes and what the native tribes gave up in order to get that. A collection that has now been digitized and is now you can actually go to archives.gov and search all those treaties. But one of the saddest moments of my time there were the visits from tribal elders and tribal lawyers who came to look at the original language to see what was promised. And there are still today cases being worked through the courts around water rights, especially water rights, that were spelled out in those treaties.
So give us some idea how many documents there are there and the types of documents.
So we are now in 42 facilities in 17 states. The flagship in Washington, D.C. on Pennsylvania Avenue, huge facility on the campus of University of Maryland in College Park. All of the military and civilian personnel records are in a huge facility in St. Louis. 15 presidential libraries, 13 of them which are physical facilities, and we can talk about that. And then regional records facilities around the country. A collection of, I scared the staff several times when I said we need to do an inventory because we don't know exactly how many, but we estimate it's somewhere around 6 billion electronic records that we've captured so far, 43 million photographs, and 53 million paper records. It's huge.
And it changed with Obama, with the Open Government Initiative. But tell us what, especially with social media, with emails, with texts, I mean, all of that changed during that time period. How do you keep track of all of that? The president does a text or someone else does something on social media. How do you track that?
That's been probably the greatest challenge in this in my tenure there. And I can remember I was on my way to one of those meetings with one of the members of the Senate committee. I was on a train from New York to Washington, reading in the New York Times that the White House had let an RFP for help in archiving their social media. And I'm saying to myself, I'm going to be the archivist of the United States, and they're going outside for help. What's the story here? And I discovered when I got on the job that the National Archives, this is 2009, wasn't doing anything with social media. And I'm kind of shocked, and discovered in my first couple of months, just nosing around, that there was a group of staff who were really interested in social media and were meeting in secret to talk about things that they might do, and just to support each other. And they recognized the fact that there was a value to this. So I found out about this group and found out their schedule and walked into one of their meetings, and they thought they were busted. And we had a great conversation about ideas that they had, and we left the meeting authorizing them to order 25 iPads and 25 iPhones, so to start experimenting and getting some use in how they might use this in our own work, but also to help the agencies. My attitude was the National Archives was responsible for providing guidance to the agencies about the records implications of the technologies they're using. And if we're not using the technologies, how on earth are we supporting them? How are we giving them that advice? So they were very excited, and the next morning I heard first from the CIO, who said, "I understand you want iPhones and iPads." And I said, "Isn't it exciting? We're going to start experimenting." And she said to me, "Well, we don't support that technology." And the next call I had was from the head of acquisitions, who said, "I understand." And I said, "Isn't it exciting? We're going to be experimenting." And I knew what was coming. And he said, "Well, that'll take about 13 months. 13 months. Which gave me some indication of what it's like to work in the federal government, to move in the federal government. And I said, that's like 2 generations of technology for me. That doesn't work. So within a month, they had this, I was going to say, I had the resignation of the CIO. She did decide to leave, not because of me, but within a month we had the iPhones and iPads, and they started using them. So that then enabled us to write the guidance, provide the guidance to the agency who were dying for some kind of help, since all the agencies were now creating websites using whatever kind of applications out there. This whole flap with Hillary Clinton and her email, the use of personal devices and personal email accounts was another thing that we had to clarify in our guidance in both the Presidential Records Act and the Federal Records Act, that it's okay to use those outside facilities as long as you copy any government business that you have. In those rare instances where you can't use your government account to do this business, if you have to use your personal account, then you need to transfer those records to your government account. So that's a piece of guidance that came out of those initiatives. But staying on top of each of one of those applications, especially the Snapchat and those kinds of phone-based applications, which didn't in the early days have archival capacity. Most of them now do. That was the challenge.
So probably most of us have been to the archives. We've seen the Charters of Freedom, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights. But I understand, and I don't know if you ever gave tours yourself, but I understand there's one question that's almost every time asked when someone's on a tour in the rotunda of the National Archives. Can you tell us what that is?
Can we see the back of the Declaration of Independence?
And
what's on the back of the Declaration of Independence?
And why do they ask that question?
National Treasure, the movie National Treasure. It is still, everyone who comes into that rotunda still thinks that that story is true. And
has Nicolas Cage been there too on those tours, or?
I don't think he's ever been there. And it's funny, they didn't allow, and I never knew why, they never allowed them to film at the National Archives. That was all filmed at Natural History in New York, I think. It's not the National Archives. But it still has a lot of cachet in the rotunda.
So have you looked at the back of the Declaration
Yes, I
of
have.
Independence?
I have actually looked at it.
And is there writing on the back?
There is writing on it.
The same writing that he talks about in National
No,
Archives?
of course not. No, in fact, I fought with the folks in the, thanks for reminding me, I fought with the folks in the gift shop to create, since this was so popular, to create a version of this, since we sell copies of the Declaration, a version of it with that on the back to fit in with
Couldn't get him
all,
to do it?
All that's written on it is the date. It says the Declaration of Independence and the date. That's in pencil on the back of it. That's all.
So I'd watched a number of YouTube interviews that you've done, and you talked about your accomplishments that you're most proud of. Citizen archives, the digitation that you talked about, the coming up of a presidential library model, and you did some exhibits and exhibitions there, one on Vietnam, one on food and things like that. But there was one that I was fascinated by, and that was sleepovers in the rotunda. Can you tell us what that is?
One of the things, this is an idea that I stole from, I think it was Natural History in New York, who did the first one, or started this trend of sleepovers. And I wanted to do one in New York, in the Rosemary Main Reading Room in the New York Public Library, and the lawyers wouldn't let me. So as soon as I got to the National Archives and wandered around the rotunda, I said, this is it, we're doing sleepovers. And we started twice a year, kids 8 to 12 years old, with an adult. About 80 of them come on a Saturday afternoon and spend the evening with us with a series of activities and related to the records, where they learned about our history. And Sunday morning, a pancake breakfast where the archivist flips pancakes and says goodbye to them. But they sleep on the floor of the rotunda in the presence of the charters. And this is a group of self-selecting nerds, kids who just love our history, and a parent who also loves our history, who just are tingling with excitement about the opportunity.
So I told Jamie about this, and he's already said he's going to make an application to go and take his grandkids there.
Super. So. There's a lot of grandparent participation in this. And I did the first one. I did the first year, and it's the snoring that we spent a lot of time messing with HVAC to make sure that it was quiet, overnight. So one of my staff spent the night in there with mechanical folks to ensure that it would be quiet, and it is so quiet that snoring is the biggest problem. So when I'm flipping pancakes, the kids are always excited and have slept well, and the parents are groggy, and it's because of the snoring.
So there were two other things I learned that I did not know that you're responsible for, the U.S. Archivist is responsible for. That's the constitutional amendment process, and you've talked about that with the ERA and that in some of the videos I saw. And the Electoral College. You have a role in certifying the Electoral College. But what I want to kind of talk about now, since we have about 15 minutes left, is the Presidential Records Act and what your involvement as the U.S. Archivist is in that. I know that there's a lawsuit involved in some criminal charges, I believe, with regards to President Trump, and I know that you are potentially a witness in that, and so you talk about, per se, that aspect. But can you tell us about what the Presidential Records Act is and what the U.S. Archivist's role is in that?
Sure. Prior to the Nixon administration, the presidents, starting with Hoover, once FDR established the kind of the benchmark of a presidential library, and Hoover came into the fold, there was sort of a gentleman's agreement that since we had a National Archives and since we had a presidential library system in its infancy, that their records would come to the government. Before that, the records pre-Hoover are spread out all over the country. The Library of Congress has a lot of them, but and some of the personal homesteads have some of them, but in terms of comprehensive collections, it's Library of Congress and the National Archives. President Nixon is kind of the landmark incident which triggered the creation of the Presidential Records Act. President Nixon, when he left office, decided that he was taking the records with him because they're his records, and stop me if you can. And he took them to California and built a presidential library. And then Congress decided to get involved, and then legislation was created to ensure that basically everything that's created in the White House during an administration belongs to the federal government. And then the negotiations started with the family, and finally the family caved, and the collection and the building and the museum became part of the National Archives. So the Presidential Records Act basically spells out categories of information that's being collected, and it's basically everything that any piece of paper or digital communication in the course of the business of the White House by the President and the Vice President and the White House staff is federal record and governed by the Presidential Records Act, like the way the Federal Records Act covers what happens in the agencies. Every agency and the White House have a separate records management operation. They have a records manager and a fleet of staff who are responsible for ensuring that the records are created and maintained and transferred to the National Archives at the appropriate time. These folks report to the head of their agency. They don't report to the National Archives. And the great difference between the Federal Records Act and the Presidential Records Act is I have the authority on the federal side to intervene when things go wrong, to do investigations if we think there's some problem with the way records are being handled or access to records. And on the presidential side, I have the opportunity to provide guidance to the White House.
So the distinction is in the White House, they have their own records management team and system.
Right.
And you're not involved in maintaining or collecting those documents during the presidency.
That's right.
And
exactly.
then at the end, what happens is they're supposed to transfer it.
Exactly. So the way that works, unlike on the federal side, the records stay in the agency it's not administration dependent. So records are scheduled, the records are described, and at the time they're described, they have a lifespan within the agency. They're needed in the agency for a certain number of years, 10, 15 years before they get transferred to the National Archives. So it doesn't change with the administration, but on the presidential side, at the end of a presidential administration, the records are moved to the National Archives. The National Archives takes custody. Actually, it's during the inaugural ceremony that this takes place, that my staff is in the White House grabbing anything that isn't tied down. I'm talking about paper records now. Electronic records we handle differently. It's much smoother than paper record transfer. But all that happens, and it's because the records of the presidency are maintained during the administration by those folks in the White House.
So can you talk some about the record-keeping processes
Sure.
of President Trump and his
Sure.
office?
It's a mess. as you have seen in the press. So there is, as we talked about, there is a unit within the White House called the White House Office of Records Management, the WORM, a group of 18 folks who are responsible for providing guidance to the folks in the White House about what I just described, about the creation and maintenance of records. And as you might imagine, at the beginning of each administration, this is a startup period where people need to get used to what the rules and regulations are. And so my staff spends more time than normal during the startup to ensure that people are, especially in the social media environment, are following the rules around creation of records. And we, as I said, we provide training and guidance, and it's compounded by the fact that at the change of administrations, there are 4,000 presidential appointments. I don't know if you knew that or not, but there are 4,000 people leaving the administration and 4,000 people coming in. So there's a huge training issue across the government in training the new 4,000 people coming in about what the rules and regulations are, as well as capturing everything that those 4,000 who are leaving, making sure that they're leaving their stuff behind. So that's another thing that's going on. On the presidential side, another compounding factor, this is really funny, is we never know whether it's going to be a 1 or 2 term administration. So we can't wait until the end of the administration to find out. We need to be prepared for moving that stuff whenever. So we start negotiations, catch this, about midterm, first term, we start negotiations with the White House about, so if it is a 1-term administration, where do you think the presidential library will be? So that gets...
Can I ask you, though, because we're kind of getting close to our time, and
yeah.
I think this is probably the elephant in the room in some sense.
Well, let me tell you about what I know.
Okay, you...
At the end of the year, after the convention, after the presidential election, I made the call to my friend at the White House, the head of the WORM, to wish him a Happy New Year and blah, blah, blah. And in that call, he told me that there are 24 boxes of records being stored in the residence. Records stored in the residence. We don't store records in the residence. And that those were being promised to him, the WORM, in time to be transferred on Inauguration Day. Inauguration Day came, those 24 boxes were not accounted for, and that started more than a year's worth of negotiations between me and Mark Meadows about where the hell are the records, where are the boxes. And finally, as you read in the papers, 15 boxes were turned in. In those 15 boxes, real mix of stuff. In those 15 boxes, we found classified records, and it was the classified information that really frosted me in terms of what got away, and that was all I needed to turn this over to Department of Justice to investigate. So once that happens, I turned this case over to Justice, I had no input into or knowledge of whether they were treating it seriously or what they were doing with this information that I passed on. So I was as surprised as anyone when I read about the raid at Mar-a-Lago and they discovered, all these other boxes. What bothers me about the whole case is what the legal case is focused on classified information, which is really important. I'm not denigrating that, but what got away was more than classified information. Boxes and boxes of stuff that we don't know exactly what was in those boxes. That isn't classified, that is part of our history. Records from the White House. We knew and we know that the laxity in the White House in terms of treatment of records. We know about him tearing up records. We know about him flushing records down the toilet. And we know about, thanks to Cassidy Hutchinson's book, we know about Mark Meadows locked in his office, burning records in the fireplace in his White House, in his office. So bad that Debbie, his wife, got in touch with Cassidy to say, can you stop him? All of Mark's clothes smell like smoke. Total disregard for our records.
So I appreciate that, and I know that's, as an archivist, that's probably hard to imagine and hard in some sense to talk about. So I want to turn it to a little lighter side as we have just a few minutes. In your 12 years, were there documents that you came upon or found that were surprising to you?
Shocking. When I met with the directors of the presidential libraries the first time, we were at the Carter Library, and we went around the room, and the director of the Kennedy handed me a copy of a letter that a kid wrote to the president asking for information about the proposed Peace Corps. And it's a letter from me. 2 weeks later, I was at the Johnson Library, and they handed me a copy of a letter that I sent to LBJ congratulating him for signing the Civil Rights Act. And the Eisenhower found two letters that I had written to President Eisenhower. One asking for a photograph suitable for framing. And the staff, my staff was so sick of hearing about these letters that one day the staff came running in. We just found this letter that you wrote to President Taft. Taft had a summer home in Beverly, Massachusetts, and I'm from Beverly, Massachusetts, so that's what the letter was supposedly about.
So tell us, who uses the archives?
Our biggest user group are veterans.
And why is that? Why
because all the military records are, as I said, all discharge records are in St. Louis, so people who are veterans who are trying to exercise their education rights, medical benefits, families for burial rights, home loans for veterans need proof of their separation. So they get through us. Genealogists, historians, and the general public.
So I have to tell you that I learned so much, and I've become so fascinated by it that it's going to be my next trip to go there and enjoy it better.
Great.
But we have 1 minute left. Tell us why we should go. Why should we go to the U.S. Archives in Washington, D.C.?
For your own experience, if you haven't been and stood in front of the charters and just think about these things were created in Philadelphia, signed in Philadelphia, dragged to New York, dragged to Washington. The night before the British burned the town, Stephen Pleasanton, a clerk in the State Department, rolled them up, commandeered a wagon on the street, took them into the hills of Virginia. Just think about, what these things have been through, but pay attention to who's in the rotunda. It's parents, grandparents with their kids, educating them about, look, this is where we came from. This is what we're all about. This is what you're responsible for. So
I'm so honored to have met you, to have researched you, to found out about this. I'm so happy you came.
Thank you.
This was wonderful. So
thank you
very much.
Thanks.